Hello everybody, welcome back to Needle Workshop. My name is Emily and today I'll be showing you two different methods to create cutouts and style lines for your different costume designs. These techniques can be used with a variety of different patterns, including our jumper pattern, which will be out shortly for sale on our website, so stay tuned for that. For this tutorial, I'll be using said pattern as a base to develop two different styles. We also use this same technique and pattern to create a variety of our past commissions, including all these deku outfits, and this one made for I Would Cosplay. If you're also looking to get Deku's accessories done, I'd recommend using Lawrence's patterns. I'll link the store in the description box below. We've also used the following method to make all the applique and style lines for the following past commissions and personal projects. It's honestly two very versatile methods and they can be used in a lot of different costumes. And with no further ado, let's take a look at these techniques. We'll start the video with the applique method. It's an excellent method to use if you're trying to create applique using fabric that frays, or if you're looking to make a stretch garment with top stitched applique. You'll need to take out your pattern pieces and start drawing out the shapes you want where you want them. I recommend doing this after you've already made a mock-up without any style lines and fitted it properly to your body and made those corrections to the pattern. I'm going to mark where my bands for the side seams are going to go while taking into account that half of it will appear on the front piece and the other half on the back piece. Also remember that you have your seam allowance to take into account. Next, I'll be developing the front piece on the chest. This is a made-up design, but everything is meant to be completely straight, so I'm using my ruler to properly draw out my lines. Importantly here, I've decided to make these shapes using two separate pieces. I have my band on the side, which will be its own applique piece, and then my front design, which will be a separate piece. This implies that the band will be overlapped over the chest design. Using a highlighter to mark out your lines is a good way to keep everything clear amidst the visual chaos of the pattern. I'm also going to measure out the length I need for the side band since it'll just be easier to make a separate rectangular piece rather than tracing out this piece proper. Last but not least, I've decided to make an applique for this sleeve. I started by folding my sleeve in half to find my center line. Using that line as a reference, I'm going to draw out the band that I want. I'm then drawing out the crossband sections that I want. Contrarily to the previous piece, I don't want these to be overlapping, so I'm going to cut them all out as one piece without any overlapping bands. Now that we've got our design all set up, we're going to create our separate pattern pieces. I'm starting by pinning down my pattern piece so it doesn't shift around. I'm going to start by tracing the contour areas where my applique pieces are, and then using a tracing wheel, I'm going to trace out all my lines. I'm using a ruler to keep my lines straight. You can't see very well on camera, but there are small punctured holes in the paper that allow me to see my shape. I'm going to go ahead and draw out those lines with a pencil so I can see them a little bit more clearly. Last but not least, add seam allowance all around your shape if you're looking to fold in your edges. At Needle Workshop, we always use 1 centimeter seam allowance. And there you have it, our first applique pattern piece is ready. A sidebar here, if your fabric doesn't fray, like if you're using faux leather or vinyl for instance, you can opt out of adding seam allowance and simply sew along the raw edges of your shape when applying it to your garment. Here are two very similar suits, but one has the applique sewn into place with raw edge, while the other one has seam allowance which was turned in before being sewn into place. Both ways are perfectly fine, but if your faux leather is giving a sharp contrasted edge, for instance, you might want to add the seam allowance to hide that. And this tutorial will show you exactly how to do that. Now I'm going to use the same technique to create my 2 other pieces. For the side seam band, I calculate how wide and how long I wanted it to be and added 1 cm seam allowance afterwards. Bands are straight rectangles, so there's no need to trace these types of pieces out at all. I'm going to go ahead and cut out all my pieces. For this project, I'm using a stretch ribbed fabric so that I can show you that it's possible to do this method with a rather finicky and hard fabric to work with that is prone to fraying. Using tracing paper and another type of tracing tool, you're going to trace the placement of the applique onto each piece of your costume. Make sure to use the original drawing from the pattern for this, since you want the tracing not to include any of the added seam allowance. For the side seam band, I'm just measuring out the distance from the edge using my ruler. If you make a little bit of a mess, don't worry too much about it. Tracing paper is meant to be fully washable. Next, if your fabric frays like mine, you'll need to overlock the edges of all your applique pieces. If you're using vinyl or faux leather, skip this step entirely. Next, you'll need to do a small straight stitch at all the concave corners of your piece 1 centimeter away from the edge, or whatever the seam allowance of your piece is. This stitch need only be about 4 centimeters long. To help with the next step, I suggest buying yourself some wash away quilting tape. Apply a little piece of tape along your stitched lines. Remove the sticker from the back of the tape and add another small piece in the corner to reinforce it. Cut into the inner corner up to your stitch and then fold in your seam allowance. Use as much or as little tape as needed to keep your line as straight and clean as possible. You can also mark out your seam allowance with a chalk pen to help you visually fold your seam allowance in properly. Make sure to iron everything into place. I did end up adding some extra pieces of tape to further reinforce the corners, but also to help the piece stick in place when I sew it. Place your piece and pin it in place before moving to your sewing machine. A few tips here. Number 1, if you're using vinyl or faux leather, you'll need to protect it when ironing it. Since it's plastic, it won't take well to heat. And by that I mean it will literally melt. So make sure to keep your iron at a lower setting and protect your vinyl using a spare piece of fabric. I usually just use like muslin scraps for that. Number 2, iron your applique fabric before cutting them out. Fabric can shrink due to heat, so ironing it before will allow it to shrink before cutting out the pieces versus it shrinking after you've already cut out your pieces, which will distort all the proportions. I personally messed up on that, so don't make that mistake. When sewing, you can use a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch. If you're looking to retain a maximum amount of stretch for your jumper or whatever piece of garment you're sewing, then use a zigzag stitch. Simply follow the edge and sew in place. Here is the finished sleeve and the finished front piece. Before being able to apply my side bands, there's a little bit of assemblage to do. I've also decided to extend the sleeve piece up onto the shoulders, so I redid the sleeve applique after sewing the sleeves to the bodice. The application method here stays the same. I've extended the band up to the neckline, and sewing the sleeve into place before applying the applique allows me to do that. Now I'm going to go ahead and sew the outseam of the bodice and sleeves, and this will allow me to put in my long side band. I have a separate technique to suggest for the long rectangular pieces. I went ahead and marked the placement of my band on one side. I'm now marking 1 centimeter away from the placement towards the inside of the applique piece. 1 centimeter is the length of my seam allowance. After folding in the end that will be placed right under my armpit by 1 centimeter, I start aligning my band right side to right side along the last marked line and pinning it into place. I'm going to zigzag stitch it in place 1 centimeter from the edge. Once that's done, I'm going to fold in the other side of the band by 1 centimeter before flipping the band over and ironing everything flat and pinning it into place. I zigzag top stitch everything into place along the outer edges, including at the top of the band right under the armpit. And with that, everything for my applique is done. You can develop so many different costumes with a variety of different style lines using this technique. Personally, I find it best for thinner motifs or straight lines, but you could also use it to do curves or even lettering. Though for anything with a lot of curves and lettering, I would recommend using a fabric that doesn't fray so you can go raw edge and get some really clean curved lines. Now, when it comes to big motifs that are multicolored, the following technique that I'm about to show you is better suited in my opinion, and I call it the cutout method. To begin with, here's a sad little sketch of what I'm attempting to make. Once again, make sure to make a mock-up first and adjust the pattern as needed prior to starting this. I want an even length bib around my neckline. I'm measuring my shoulder length and using that length to slowly measure out my piece. I've decided to eliminate the seam allowance and make a new piece on fold. I'm continuing the same shape at the front and adding a lower front band. Cut out your pattern pieces. You can add some notches into the curves to help with the sewing later and name your pieces to avoid any confusion. If you end up having a lot of cutout pieces, I definitely recommend putting in a lot of notches and definitely recommend naming every single piece. Tape the cutout section to paper and add a seam allowance to each piece. I'm doing a 1 centimeter seam allowance, as per usual. Extend your notch into the seam allowance and voila! You have created separate pieces which allow you to add different colored designs to your final piece. If your pieces have corners to sew, I recommend checking out our video on the subject matter. It will definitely help you sew these types of pieces together more easily, and there's a very specific technique to it. So for anybody who needs it, it will be linked in the description box below. I've gone ahead and sewn one side of my front pieces with a straight stitch and the other side with a zigzag stitch. Let's go over the differences. A straight stitch is more likely to break if you're looking to keep the piece very stretchy. If your piece is made from a woven fabric and has no stretch, then this straight stitch is perfectly fine when sewing the two pieces together. You'll definitely still need to overlock your raw edges though. You can even add a top stitch if it's a visual element that you would like. Personally, I didn't, since this is one of the advantages of this technique over the previous one. No visual top stitch is needed. The zigzag stitch will allow you to retain a maximum amount of stretch. It can be tricky to sew the corners though, since you don't want to cut into your stitch when you're doing them. With a zigzag stitch, you can omit the overlock, but I personally still use it to maximize the durability of my piece. In my opinion, the end results are on par with one another. So I'm going to go ahead and install my back piece as well and then sew the full piece. And here are the results of the finished product. So both techniques can give incredible results and can be used on a variety of different costumes, both stretch and non-stretch. We used our jumper pattern here to create both these pieces, but you can let your imagination run wild and use it on all kinds of patterns. It could be tops, jumpers, overalls, zentai suits. You can use it on skirts. You can use it on capes. Honestly, it can be used on anything. And I think that covers everything for today's video. I sincerely hope this was helpful. I tried to be as thorough as possible in the video. So if you like this, make sure to give it a thumbs up and make sure to subscribe because your support is very important to this channel. And as always, you can follow us on any of our social media and you can tag us if you want us to see your projects and share them. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below. And as always, good luck with your projects, guys. Bye-bye.